Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to week number 5. If you can believe it, we're already in week 5 of the semester, so it does proceed very, very quickly. Uh, Not a whole lot of weeks left in our hybrid 8-week course, so a lot of information to cover, but I think tonight the agenda will be a little bit lighter than it's been in some previous weeks because tonight the only topic I really want to cover is to finish our discussion of the discipline or field of public administration and discuss the different theoretical approaches that we have seen develop over about the past 150 years or so. So I don't think it will take our entire time tonight, and we'll be able to free up maybe the second part of class for you to have some time to continue work on your midterm assessment. But speaking of the midterm assessment, let's talk briefly about some of the assignments that you've done and some of the assignments that you have coming due, and then clear up any questions or anything you have about those assignments. So the draft advancement to candidacy forms, I've reviewed all of those and then returned those with a 5 out of 5 grade and some very brief feedback. For the vast majority of the forms, it was just the course sequencing looks good because you sequenced the core courses correctly, having 697 being after you've completed all your other core courses. And so there weren't many issues there. In terms of the electives, right now with this draft form, you're just kind of speculating in terms of what's going to be offered. We're not really sure in future semesters what the schedule will look like. So at this point, we're just kind of speculating what electives will be taken in which semester. When you actually do then advance the candidacy next spring, you'll be able to talk with Dr. Butts or Dr. Zhao, and they'll probably have a better idea of what future semester schedules are going to look like, because Dr. Butts, as department chair, is the one who puts those schedules together. So he'll probably have a good idea. When I was chair, I tried to map out the next 2 or 3 years of schedule, so I had a pretty decent idea of what electives would be offered based upon staffing and budget. Then your Canvas essay number 2, the accountability one, looking at ASPA Code of Conduct. I think those are all fine. Everyone did a nice job. I provide some feedback. I saw a lot of people talking about fully informed advice, which makes a lot of sense because of what we discussed with the principal-agent relationship. A lot of folks talked about promoting democratic participation, which is certainly more important today than perhaps it's ever been in the past. Some people talked about promoting the public interest and how important that is. Some talked about encouraging professional development of others. So I think those essays were very well done. Now, your next 2 assignments that are coming due for next week is you have the midterm assessment. And we talked about the midterm assessment in class last week, and I walked you through all the 5 of the scenarios. Up to this point, you have the information you need to address scenarios 1 through 4. The information for scenario 5 will come tonight with our discussion of these theoretical perspectives on public administration. So by the end of our class tonight, you'll have all the information that you need in order to complete the midterm assessment. The midterm assessment is scheduled to be submitted by midnight on the 24th, which is midnight on next Sunday. Again, be parsimonious, be concise with your answers. I'm not looking for more than maybe a paragraph or 2 response for each one of the questions. If you need to go beyond that, you certainly can. I'm not looking for any outside research, and so you shouldn't be going out there and putting a lot of citations in, because I'm not really looking for that outside research. I'm looking for you to use the information that we cover in class, the information from the classics text, the information from the Kettle text, maybe information you've gleaned from the participating with your colleagues in the discussion area, but that's where the information is going to come from. So don't worry about doing a whole lot of research in terms of answering these questions. What I am concerned about is, can you take the information and apply the information appropriately in appropriate scenarios? So that's the midterm assessment. And then you also have Canvas number 3, and Canvas essay number 3 is then due next Monday. Canvas essay number 3 is your public-private differences type of essay. And so what you'll do is you will compare your organization, if you're working at a public organization, to a private sector organization, 2 similarities versus 2 differences. If you're working in a private sector organization, you can then compare it to a public organization, 2 similarities, 2 differences. If you're working in a nonprofit organization, you have your choice. You can either compare it to a public or a private organization, 2 similarities and 2 differences. If you're not currently working in an organization, that's fine as well. You can either use one of the previous organizations that you work for, regardless of whether it's public, private, or nonprofit, or you can use an organization that you are interested in, maybe an organization you'd like to work for someday after you get your MPA, or just an organization that you are familiar with. So it's completely up to you, but don't feel like you can't do the assignment if you're not currently working in an organization, because you certainly can. And so Canvas essay number 3, your initial post, as well as your responses to classmates, will be due then by midnight next Monday, which I believe is September 25th. So those are the 2 assignments that you have coming up due midterm on Sunday, and then the Canvas essay number 3 on Monday. Any questions at all on either the midterm assessment or on Canvas essay number 3?
I have a quick question. You mentioned, this is Lauren, by the way, you mentioned no citations are necessary since we don't need to do outside research. Did you still need us to cite any of the like the texts, or can we just disregard needing to do any citations at all?
You don't have to worry about citations for this because this is just an assessment. So
Okay.
it's not like a written paper. So no, you don't have to worry about that. If you want to talk, if you're talking about, say, for instance, Federalist number 39, you can say Madison and Federalist 39 says, and that's going to be good enough there in text. Same type of thing if you're talking about maybe Graham Allison and his article on public-private differences. You could just say, Graham Allison or Allison illustrates that the difference is, and just talk about it like that. And that's going to be sufficient for this assignment. So does that help?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Good. And I'll just a note of caution, that's for this assignment in this class. This course is the introductory course in the program. It's a little bit different than your other courses you're going to be taking. So whenever you're writing papers in other courses, yes, you are going to have to cite your sources. You'll have to cite your sources according to APA format using the in-text citation method of author and then parentheses, year of publication, and then have a reference page with the full APA citations for everything you use. That's what you're going to have to do in future courses. This is a little bit different because it's not a written research paper. So we kind of bend the rules a little bit here in 500. So no need on this assignment for citations. Good question.
Got it. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or clarifications? Okay, as always, as you are working on the midterm assessment, shoot me an email, any questions at all, and I'm more than happy to respond to any of those questions. And as you probably noticed by now, I tend to be very responsive to emails, and so you'll certainly get a response from me within 24 hours and probably a heck of a lot sooner than that. Always happy to answer any questions you have. Okay, let's move into our last bit of information that will be covered on the midterm assessment. And that's this discussion of the theoretical perspectives on the study of public administration. Now, this really does tie in very well with what we talked about last week when we talked about the development of public administration as a field of study. And when we're considering whether public administration is a field of study or an academic discipline, it kind of boils down to the idea of uniqueness. How unique are the phenomena that we study in public administration, and how unique do the methods and approaches to studying those phenomena need to be? The more unique public administration is, the more likely it is an academic discipline. So when you're looking at something to determine whether or not it's an academic discipline, you're really looking to see, did that field of study develop unique theories and unique methods for studying phenomena? So it's important to kind of segue off of that with this discussion of theoretical perspectives. So what types of theories do we use in the field or discipline of public administration? And the theories we have used have really changed over time. And what we're going to do tonight is kind of walk you through very briefly, and again, this is a very brief overview, but walk you through very briefly the chronological development of these theoretical approaches and how our views of administration, how our views of organizations have changed since the late 1800s. I think it's helpful to do it chronologically because it really then gives you a flavor of how the field has evolved and how the field has changed over time. So where we start our discussion with these theoretical perspectives is we usually back up to the late 1800s. And we start in the late 1800s with a school of thought known as the classical school. Now, the classical school, some of those theories are kind of outdated today. We have seen a lot of flaws in some of these classical theories. But despite all the flaws that we're going to identify in these classical theories, there are a lot of artifacts and vestiges of these theories that are alive and well in modern day organizations. And when you look at your organizations, what I'm hoping you will do is as we talk about these theories and these schools of thought, you'll reflect upon your organization and think about, well, which of these elements and what of these theories do I see in my organization, in my current position? Because as a public administration program, our ultimate goal is to always find that nexus between theory and practice. So let's start with the classical approach to viewing organizations. The classical approach starts in the late 1800s, and three of the primary theorists in the classical school that we talk about here in this class are Max Weber, Frederick Taylor, and Luther Gulick. And you'll see the three gentlemen on the screen, Max Weber at the bottom left, Frederick Taylor in the middle, and then at the bottom right with the very impressive facial hair is Luther Gulick. So those are the three main classical theorists that we talk about when we talk about this classical school. And what I like to do is when I talk about each one of these theorists, talk about what differentiates them from each other, but also what ties them together. And we'll see that there is a thread that ties all of our classical theorists together in terms of their focus. So the first one, if you've done any undergraduate work in public administration, you have read about this person. The first one is Max Weber. Max Weber brings kind of a sociological approach to his study of organizations. Max Weber, who is writing in the late 1800s primarily, really thought a lot of organizations. He thought organizations were what he considered to be the apex of rationality. Essentially, what Weber believed in is he believed that in administration, we should be making our decisions based upon empirical evidence and information. We shouldn't just make decisions because we've got a gut feeling that this is the right thing to do, or because we believe in this. We should make our decisions based upon the collection and analysis of empirical information. That's what he considered to be rationality. And so he felt that a bureaucratic organization, because it was predicated upon empirical information, it was pretty much at what he considered to be the apex, the top of rationality. And he really had a lot of faith in rationality as the way in which you make decisions. For Weber, his ultimate goal was organizational effectiveness. He wanted to make organizations more effective at achieving their goals and their objectives. So we often say that Weber took what we call a macro level approach. There's a macro organizational level approach. So at the end of the day, his ultimate goal would be the goals of the organization itself, not the goals of individual employees. He felt almost that individual employees were kind of ancillary to the well-being of the organization itself. In order to make organizations effective, Weber believed that they needed to be structured in accordance with what he referred to as his ideal bureaucracy. So he had this idealized view of what bureaucratic organizations should look like. And if an ideal bureaucratic organization exhibited these different characteristics, that is what will make them effective at achieving their goals and their objectives. So for Weber, the structure of the organization was of paramount importance. The way in which you want to structure an ideal bureaucratic organization was, number one, is what he called the tall hierarchy. So again, it's this pyramidal shape, kind of an ugly pyramid there in the camera, but a pyramidal shape, whereby at the apex of the pyramid, you had one singular leader of the organization. Then as you move down the organizational structure, you will encounter more and more positions until when you get to the bottom of your pyramid, that's where most of the people in the organization work. So that's what we refer to as a tall hierarchy. In this tall hierarchy, orders and directives would flow from above. And so information, mandates in terms of what to do and how to do it, those would flow from the top of the pyramid and flow down the organization structure. He believed in this tall hierarchical organization. We should also have division of labor. There are a lot of work. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in an organization. So in order to be more efficient and more effective, we need to divide that work up among the members of the organization. So he really did believe very much in division of labor. One great example of division of labor is how we see an organization like the U.S. House of Representatives operate today. House of Representatives is very much built upon this idea of division of labor. You have committees, and then you have subcommittees beneath those committees. That's dividing up the work, dividing up the labor. When you divide up the labor, each individual employee then gets their own set of tasks and responsibilities. When they get their own set of tasks and responsibilities, these tasks and responsibilities those are what they will be doing on a daily basis. So if you're doing the same job every single day, day in and day out, you really start to specialize in those jobs. And by specializing in those jobs, you actually become an expert in how to do those jobs, because who else is doing them as often as you are? You are the one who then becomes an expert on what you're doing, thanks to specialization of tasks that flows out of this idea of division of labor. He also believes in these tall hierarchical organizations, you should have what he refers to as a unity of command, a chain of command. Sometimes in the classical literature, this is what's referred to as being a scalar chain. That text chat, but sometimes you'll see people refer to it as a scalar chain. A scalar chain is this chain of command, whereby everyone knows to whom they are responsible in the organization. So this employee is responsible to the employee above them, who is responsible to the employee above them. You can draw lines through your organization structure to see where the authority lies and who is responsible to whom. Also, with this idea of a scalar chain, this chain of command, you also have what's called a span of control. Weber realized that you couldn't have one person responsible for thousands of other people in the organization. We needed to limit the responsibility of each manager in an organization. So we'll have one employee, a manager, who may then be responsible for the actions of 3 or 10 or 15 employees. That's what you call a limited span of control. If they are only responsible for 10 or 15 employees, then they'll have the time to actually oversee those 10 or 15 employees. These people who work in this tall hierarchical setting are also professional career employees. They are there for a career. So he didn't envision a situation like we oftentimes see today, where employees tend to be kind of free agents, and that they'll work in an organization for a couple of years until they get a better offer, then they jump to another organization, then another organization. Weber kind of looked at it as people are in this organization for their entire career. They are professional employees, and they view this as a career type of vocation. And everything that goes on within that ideal bureaucratic structure is predicated upon written documentation. It's very important that we write everything down, that we have written rules, regulations, and policies that we can follow. The benefit of having a lot of written documentation is that it allows you to treat people fairly. And so you treat people in accordance with what the policies and the rules say you should do. So you're not treating people in an arbitrary or capricious or prejudicial manner. Everyone gets treated the same in accordance with the rules and the processes. The downside, obviously, of a lot of written documentation is what we know today in modern bureaucracies as red tape. And we said last time that's one of the reasons why people have such a negative view of bureaucracy is because of all the red tape, all the policies and rules and regulations that we must follow. But as you can see under Weber's ideal bureaucracy, we have a very structured, very rational, very regimented structure to our organization. And Weber really believed that by achieving this regimented structure, we could then make our organizations both effective as well as efficient. One aspect you don't see talked a lot here is the aspect of the individual employee. Weber really, again, saw employees as being more or less incidental to the goals of the organization. So there's not a lot of discussion here about the wants, needs, and desires of the employees who are working in this very regimented structure. It was mostly all about the macro level, achieving the goals of the organization. A second classical theorist who's writing a little bit after Max Weber is our good friend Frederick Taylor. And Frederick Taylor's theories really kind of hit their heyday in the early 1920s. Frederick Taylor is a classical theorist because he is again concerned about the goals of the organization. He is concerned about making the organization as productive and as effective and as efficient as possible. The difference between Taylor and Weber is that Taylor had looked at achieving this in a different way than Weber did. For Weber, effectiveness was predicated upon organization structure. For Taylor, effectiveness and efficiency would be predicated upon the work itself and the process of doing the work. Taylor had a relatively poor view of employees, and that's putting it very lightly. If you read any of Taylor's original work, you'll see that he referred to employees as being boorish beasts. He also referred to them as being cogs in the machinery of the organization. So it's a very dehumanizing way of viewing employees. Back when I was in graduate school, my very first assignment as a TA is I had a professor who told me, I'm not going to be here tomorrow, so you're going to have to lead our class, and the class will be about Frederick Taylor and scientific management. So learn everything you can about Frederick Taylor and scientific management. So the first class I did as a TA was a 3-hour course on scientific management and Frederick Taylor. But there is a lot here with Frederick Taylor and scientific management. But his focus is again on work processes. The goal for Frederick Taylor was to find what he called the one best way to do a job. He felt if we could identify the best way to do a job, and then we could teach our employees how to do that job in that one best way, that is what's going to make our organization efficient and effective. So whereas Weber is looking for the one best way to structure the organization, Taylor is looking for the one best way to structure the processes of work. And so his approach came to be known as scientific management. And so what Frederick Taylor would do is he would literally do what we call time motion studies. And you've probably read about these or heard about these before, whereby Taylor would stand behind an employee who's doing a job with a stopwatch and would time every single movement that that employee took in the course of doing their job throughout the day. So the classic example he used was a very simple job such as shoveling pig ore. So he had employees who had a shovel, and they would then pick up a shovel of pig ore. They would then move that shovel over to a cart, and they would then dump the pig ore in the cart, then go back to the pile, put their shovel in again, pick up another pile, take it over the cart, dump it in the cart. It's a very rudimentary manual labor type of job like that. So what he would do is he would stand there and he would time every single movement they took. So he would time how long it took them to pick their shovel up, how long it took them to put the shovel into the pile of pig ore, how long it took them to lift a shovel full of pig ore, how long it took them to move that shovel full of pig ore over to the cart, how long it took them to dump that into the cart, how long it took them to go back to the pile, and then how long it took them to start the job over again. He would time each one of those movements. Those are what he called his time motion studies. The idea here was that if he could identify efficient movements and inefficient movements, he could eliminate all the inefficient movements and then collect the efficient movements together into the one best way to do the job. So maybe there's one best way to hold the shovel that will allow you to pick up a bigger shovel full of pig iron. Well, that's an efficient movement. And so what he would then do is he would teach everyone else who was going to do that job how to do that job in that one best way. The whole idea of why Taylor and scientific management became so popular in the 1920s is that Taylor was writing at the time in which we had a lot of unrest in a lot of our factory settings. We had very dangerous work conditions. We had workers who were doing what Taylor referred to as soldiering. Soldiering is a process of just doing the bare minimum to get by day after day. And he thought a lot of these employees were soldiering. They were doing as little as they could possibly do, which obviously was hurting the efficiency of the organization. So according to Taylor, what we would do in scientific management, we would learn the one best way to do the job. We would then go out there and hire people who have the characteristics to be able to do the job in that one best way. We would then train them the one best way to do the job, bring them into the organization, and then monitor their performance to make sure that they are continuing to do the job in that one best way. If they are doing the job the way in which they're supposed to be doing it, then Taylor was all for compensation. He was very much in favor of pay for performance. So if you're doing your job well, you're being effective, you're being efficient, we're going to compensate you for your performance. However, if you were not doing your job well and you were not being effective, you were not being efficient, there was no real retraining or professional development or counseling or support. There was none of that. It was simply you take that person, remove them from the organization, and replace them with a new person. People were merely cogs in the machinery of the organization. And so when you picture a mechanism, you've got all these cogs that have teeth on them. And the way in which the mechanism runs is that as a cog turns, the tooth on one cog pushes against a tooth on another cog, which pushes on the tooth of another cog, and that's how all the cogs move. If you have a cog that has broken teeth, then obviously the mechanism's not going to move. You take that cog, you throw it away, you replace it with a better cog, and then the machinery will work much more smoothly and much more efficiently. Obviously, the downside of Taylor and scientific management is the lack of care about employees. The employees were very much just these replaceable cogs in the machinery of the organization. He didn't worry very much about the wants, needs, and desires and the goals and objectives of individual employees. It was a rather dehumanizing approach to the way in which we run our organizations. Taylor's scientific management approach really started in the private sector and was developed for private sector organizations. Then in the 1920s, because it met with what was considered to be success in the private sector, it then got transferred into the public sector in the 1920s. Now, we all realize today that one of the major issues is obviously you can't dehumanize individual employees. You can't just treat them as replaceable cogs in the machinery. Taylor didn't think a whole lot about employee morale. He didn't think a whole lot about the organization as being a social setting and a social environment. That was not really of much concern to him whatsoever. And so that was one of the major flaws associated with scientific management. But despite those flaws, if you look at your organization today, you are going to see a lot of artifacts of scientific management in your organization. Chances are you have a position description that describes the types of duties that you will do on a daily basis. It'll probably also list the percentage of time that you're spending on each one of those duties. That position description flows directly out of this idea of scientific management. In that description, we're identifying here is the quote unquote best way of doing the job. Your position probably is part of a position classification system as well. At the federal level, almost all federal employment is based upon what's called the general schedule. The general schedule is the position classification system for the federal bureaucracy. It runs from a level of GS1 up to the level of GS15. It used to go up to 18, but we'll talk about why it doesn't in a future class. But it goes essentially from GS1 up to GS15. Positions are placed into that classification system based upon the nature of the job, the requirements of the job, what you're doing on a daily basis in that job. Those types of characteristics will then place that job in those different, what we call pay grades and different pay bands. That position classification system is very common in most public organizations today. So despite the problems with scientific management, we still see a lot of scientific management alive and well in our modern day organizations. So Weber wanted to make organizations effective through his ideal bureaucratic structure. Taylor wanted to make organizations efficient and effective by identifying the one best way to do the job. Another classical author is someone by the name of Luther Gulick. Now, Weber and Taylor, when they developed their theories in settings outside of the public bureaucracy. Luther Gulick is our first real example of an author who really developed his theories based upon the public sector and then applied his theories directly into federal agencies and departments. Luther Gulick was a member of a commission known as the Brownlow Commission. The Brownlow Commission in the late 1930s was charged with the responsibility of reorganizing the federal government. When you think about the 1930s, you had the FDR administration, as we talked about with our discussion of federalism. FDR comes in 1933, and in response to the Great Depression, FDR brings with him all of these new programs and the development of all these new administrative agencies that greatly expanded the size and the scope of the federal government. The problem with that is as the federal government burgeoned in size, became larger and larger, it became next to impossible for presidents to be able to effectively manage this ever-increasing federal bureaucracy. So Luther Gulick and the Brownlow Commission had a charge to reorganize the federal government to make it so that it was easier for the president to be able to manage. And one of the major things we got out of this Reorganization Act as a result of the Brownlow Commission recommendations was the creation of this thing called the Executive Office of the President. And if you're familiar with the Executive Office of the President or the EOP, that text chat, EOP, the EOP or the Executive Office of the President is really an umbrella organization that contains management agencies. So we took a lot of these management agencies and we put them into this Executive Office of the President to kind of organize them a bit and make it a little bit easier for the president to know which agencies to direct over which policy matters. So today you have things like the White House office, which is in the Executive Office of the President, the Office of Management and Budget, which is in the Executive Office of the President, Office of Personnel Management, the Office of Drug Control Policy. So a lot of these overhead management types of agencies were placed within this EOP, again, to better allow the president to manage the federal bureaucracy. But when Gulick and the Brownlow Commission reorganized the federal bureaucracy, they reorganized it based upon Gulick's theory known as the principal school. And when you get into 660 organization theory, you will talk about several authors like Henri Fayol and others, and then Moody and some other authors who are also referred to as principal authors because they also created theories known as the principles approach. But Gulick is the one we talk about in this class because he had a direct impact upon bringing the principal school into the public sector. So what is the principal school? The principal school is essentially that generic management theory that we talked about when we talked about Graham Allison last week. Remember, Graham Allison in his article said that the similarities between public and private organizations is that they engage in the same types of generic management functions. So the what you do is the same essentially between public and private sector. The difference is in how you do it. We said that generic management functions that are shared by both the public as well as the private sector are things such as strategic planning, organizing your organization, staffing, bringing people in, bringing employees into your organization, directing their behavior, coordinating their activities within the organization, building reporting mechanisms so we can tell how effective and efficient their actions are, bringing money into the organization and engaging in budgeting. What came to be known as the principal school or the School of POSCOR, planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. This principals or POSCOR school says that if we can train our managers to be effective in carrying out these generic management functions, that is what is then going to make our organizations effective and efficient. So again, the thread that's tying Weber, Taylor, and Gulick and all the classical authors together is they were looking for the one magic bullet that will make organizations effective and efficient. And their ultimate goal was a macro level organizational goal. They were not concerned about individual employees. The differences between them is Weber looked at structure, Taylor looked at work processes, and Gulick looked at management functions. And Gulick believed if we can basically create a toolkit, if you will. So POSCOR creates this managerial toolkit, and we provide our managers with this toolkit. They can then reach into that toolkit. They can then pull out the appropriate tool to use in a given situation. So, excuse me, if you're doing plumbing and you're trying to replace an elbow in a drain or something, chances are you're going to need a pipe wrench. You're probably not going to need a Phillips screwdriver. So you need to know what tool to use in that appropriate situation. But again, all of these classical theories looked at the macro level of helping the organization achieve its goals and objectives. And typically those goals and objectives were primarily effectiveness and efficiency. And so this kind of takes us up through into the 1930s. However, we had some rumblings as all these classical theories are being developed. There were rumblings about what about the people? What about the employees who are working in these organizations? And those types of criticisms of the classical school then gave rise to what we refer to as the neoclassical schools of management. Neoclassical are just developed in response to the flaws associated with the classical school. So the neoclassical schools include schools of thought such as the human relations school, the School of Human Resource Management, the System School, and then some other discrete modern approaches that we're going to talk about a little bit later on this evening. But all those different schools, human resources, human relations, systems approach, those are all considered to be neoclassical approaches. So in scenario 5, when I'm asking you, what two classical theorists would contribute to this scenario and why, what two neoclassical theorists would contribute and why, for our purposes, the classical ones we're looking at are Weber, Taylor, and Gulick. The neoclassical ones are the ones we're going to start talking about now with this neoclassical school of thought. So the first person we start with when we talk about our neoclassical theories is Mary Parker Follett. Mary Parker Follett is one of my favorite theorists. I tend to probably talk about her way too much in my classes, but I'm a big fan of Mary Parker Follett because she was one of those theorists who was willing to stand up and take issue with scientific management and the classical approach when it wasn't acceptable to do so. So in the 1920s, when everyone was buying into scientific management and we were watching scientific management migrate en masse from the private sector into our public organizations, really the only person who stood up and was the voice in the wilderness was Mary Parker Follett. And she pointed out there are some major issues with scientific management. And the major issue is how it dehumanizes individual employees. It doesn't really provide for employees to participate in their own governance. It doesn't allow mechanisms and avenues for people to participate in their own decision making. So Follett in the 1920s was raising all these issues with scientific management. Now, when you go on to 660 into organization theory, you may see that your instructor will talk about Mary Parker Follett as a pre-human relations theorist rather than being a human relations theorist. The reason for that is because of chronologically when she was writing. She was about a decade or a decade and a half ahead of a lot of her colleagues in the human relations school. So some of the theories that she was developing in the 1920s were not then developed by her colleagues until the 1930s and the 1940s. The problem is that obviously Mary Parker Follett, as a woman writing in the 1920s, didn't get a lot of notoriety, didn't get a lot of respect. And a lot of the other human relations theorists like Elton Mayo and Fritz Roethlisberger didn't even know of her existence and really didn't base their theories on hers. They just developed their theories a couple of decades after she developed hers. So that's why Mary Parker Follett is sometimes called a pre-human relations theorist. But she really is the person who gave rise to our first neoclassical school of human relations theory. So what did Mary Parker Follett say? Mary Parker Follett talked a lot about the need for democratic organizations. Weber, Taylor, and Gulick were not creating democratic organizations. They were creating organizations that were very hierarchical in nature, where the orders came from the top and the direction was then handed down from the top levels of the organization. Follett liked to think about organizations as democratic societies. And she said we should run our organizations in a democratic way, the way in which we run a democratic society. She said we have to recognize that in a democratic society, there are a couple of natural flaws that will occur in a democratic society. And some of these flaws were identified by the framers of the Constitution, like James Madison. One flaw associated with a democracy is what she called passivity of citizens. That when people participate in their own governance, they are probably going to select the least burdensome way in which to participate. So when you think about when people participate in their own governance in a democracy, the way in which the vast majority participate is what? How do most people participate in their own governance in a democracy? Voting, exactly. Marisol says voting. We vote. That's how we usually participate. That's kind of our default method of participation. Next question is why? Why is that our default method of participation? It's easy. Yeah, as Lee says, it's easy. It really imposes very few burdens and imposes very few costs upon us. As Carlos says, easier to do. Absolutely. You think about voting and what it takes to vote and compare it to other methods of participation. In addition to voting, we could also volunteer to work on campaigns. We could volunteer in our community. We could write letters to our members of Congress or emails to our members of Congress or members of the state legislature or members of our city council or school board. We can serve on citizen oversight committees. Those are other ways. We can donate money. We could run for office ourselves. There are lots of other ways in which we can participate in a democracy, but those are all very expensive to us. And if you assume that for the most part, a person is a rational, self-interested actor, as we've talked about in previous courses, in previous class sessions, then you will assume that people will take actions that will maximize their benefits while minimizing their costs. And so voting does just that. It's low cost, it's easy to do, and you can maximize your benefits and minimize your costs. But voting is a relatively passive way of participating. Here in California, it's become even more passive because now everyone automatically gets an absentee ballot. And so now you don't even have to go to the polls in order to cast your ballot. You can just fill out your ballot at home and drop it in one of the secure voting boxes. So it's a very passive, very easy way of participation. And Follett says that's usually how people tend to participate in society That's also how people tend to participate in organizations, is they will participate in their own governance in the easiest and the quickest way to do so. So she said, we need to try and get over this burden of passivity on the part of our citizens and get people more active and get people more engaged in their participation. The second flaw associated with a democracy, according to Follett, is the flaw of particularized interests. And you're very well aware of these from your Canvas essay where you talked about Federalist Paper number 10 and James Madison. This is what Madison referred to as factions. We know that in Federalist number 10, Madison told us that factions are a necessary element in a democracy, that you cannot eliminate factions because eliminating these factions is equivalent to eliminating democracy itself. So instead of eliminating these particularized interests, we need to try and balance them. And the way in which you balance them is, again, through encouraging communication, encouraging participation. When you have these factions, when you have these particularized interests, eventually these interests are going to come into conflict with each other. Conflict is a natural part of a democratic system of government. Conflict is a natural part of a democratic organization. So Follett talked about ways in which we can resolve conflict when it inevitably occurs. She says there are three ways that you can resolve conflict both in a society as well as in an organization. The first way is domination. One faction wins, one faction loses. That, according to Follett, is the worst way of dealing with conflict because obviously the faction that loses is going to be disaffected. They're not going to be very happy with the result, and they're probably not going to buy in to the plan moving forward. So we want to try and avoid domination where we can. The second approach, which is better than domination, but still not the most appropriate approach, is what she calls compromise. This faction gives up something, this faction gives up something in order to come to a negotiated compromise. That's better than domination, but in essence, both parties are still losing. Both factions are still giving something up, so neither faction is going to be 100% satisfied with the outcome of this resolution. Follett says the most appropriate way to deal with conflict, both in society as well as an organization, is through what she calls integration, where you can integrate ideas together and then use all those different ideas and synthesize those thoughts together into a new way of dealing with the issue, a new way of solving the problem. Since all factions contributed to the creation of this new approach to solving the problem, they're going to have a vested interest in seeing that new solution be successful. The only way we get to integration is through what she calls interpenetration of ideas. She says we need to encourage participation within our organizations. We need to have effective lines of communication, both vertically as well as horizontally in our organizations, so people can share ideas. And then as they share ideas, one person's ideas will then penetrate into someone else's ideas. Through that interpenetration, we then end up getting integration into a new solution for the problem. She says integration through the interpenetration of ideas is the most effective and most appropriate way of dealing with conflict. She says in order to get to integration and interpenetration, what we need to do is we need to, again, offer avenues for communication and participation. She really did view the whole idea of power within an organization as power is not a resource that managers give to their subordinates. Power is a resource that managers help their subordinates develop. It's something to be developed, it's not something to be given. So she really envisioned active participation on the part of employees in order to solve problems and arrive at decisions. That is completely diametrically opposed to the classical school of thought. Classical school of thought, everything came down from the top to the bottom. Here we have a more bottom-up approach, where we have individual employees actually actively participating in their own governance, being given opportunities to grow as individuals, given opportunities to participate in decision making. And that's why it's considered to be more of a human relations type of an approach. In addition to Mary Parker Fall, who again was the kind of the pioneer of this approach in the 1920s, a couple of other prominent theorists that we talk about here in this class, Chester Barnard and Elton Mayo. Now, when you get into your 660 organization theory class, you'll talk about a lot of other authors who are considered human relations authors. But just because of the limited scope of this class, we look at Chester Barnard and Elton Mayo. Chester Barnard contributed to human relations theory through what he called the functions of the executive. Barnard argued that in order for leaders and managers to be effective and to accomplish the goals of the organization, they need to get the acquiescence and the compliance from their employees. The managerial success is based upon the compliance on employees. It's not just that you can tell employees to do something and expect them to do it. You oftentimes have to persuade them to do it. You have to acquire their compliance. One of the most effective ways to get the compliance of employees, according to Barnard, is by using targeted incentives. And he talked a lot about effective organizations as organizations that had the proper balance of what he called incentives and contributions. So a manager provides incentives to their employees that their employees value, and those employees will then be induced to provide contributions in the form of additional effort, in the form of higher levels of productivity that will then help the organization achieve its goals. So you really need to find the right balance between the incentives you're giving to employees and the contributions you are then extracting from them. He also talked a lot about the uniqueness of individual employees. And again, this is something that is much different than the classical theorists. For Taylor, people were just cogs in the machinery. There was really no difference between them, with the exception of their skills and their motivation. But he really didn't look at individual employees as being individual human beings. Barnard, to a degree, did. And Barnard talked about something referred to as zones of indifference. He said every employee will have a different zone of indifference. And for Barnard, the zone of indifference is that if you ask someone to do something, so you ask an employee to take an action, that action violates the values or the ethical principles of that employee is going to push back, and you're probably not going to get the compliance and the acquiescence of that employee. Barnard argued that every employee has a zone of indifference. That zone of indifference is a zone in which you're not violating their ethical principles. So if you ask someone to do something that doesn't violate their ethical principles and they like the incentives they're being given, they will give those contributions. They will give that productivity and that effort. However, if you violate their zones of indifference and you ask them to do something that violates their ethical principles, you're not going to be able to get their acquiescence and compliance. The important part here is that you need to operate within an employee's zone of indifference, but you need to know what the boundaries of that zone of indifference will be for each individual employee. So Barnard contributes to our understanding of human relations theory by telling us we need to treat employees differently based upon their own unique characteristics. It's not a one-size-fits-all type of an approach. So again, Barnard fits well with Follett because we're talking about valuing employees and valuing employee contributions. And then one of the most famous human relations theorists is Elton Mayo. And you've probably run into Elton Mayo before. You certainly have if you've taken psychology courses at the undergraduate level. Elton Mayo conducted, and his fellow theorists conducted a lot of different types of studies. One of the most famous studies and has most import for what we're talking about tonight were his Hawthorne experiments. And if you're familiar with those, what Mayo and his colleagues did is they went into the Hawthorne electrical plant. I believe it was in Illinois, went in the Hawthorne electrical plant. And what Mayo wanted to do with this study is he wanted to see what is the impact of an external stimulus on the productivity of employees. The external stimulus that he chose was a change in lighting level. And so as a good social scientist, Mayo developed his hypotheses. And so his first hypothesis was if we turn the lighting levels up, people will become more productive because they'll be able to see better. So they turned the lighting levels up, and sure enough, as the lighting levels went up, productivity went up as well. Then he said, well, then obviously, if productivity is going up as lighting levels go up, then the opposite should be true as well. That if we turn the lights down, then productivity should go down. So then they started reducing the lighting level. And as they turned lighting levels down, productivity kept going up. Rather than going down, it continued to increase. So what that showed Mayo is it wasn't the external stimulus of the lighting level that was increasing the productivity of employees. What was really increasing the productivity of the employees is that they were being talked to. They were being listened to by the researchers. And it's the first time really in this entire, their history in this factory where people are actually talking to them and asking them how they felt, what they thought about their jobs, what types of things would incentivize them to be more productive. People were actually paying attention to them as human beings. And it was that social interaction that was causing their productivity to increase. So the first takeaway from the Hawthorne experiment is that organizations are social environments. People are social creatures. When they get into organizations and these social environments, they have a need to interact with each other. They have a need to be respected. They have a need to be heard by others within the organization. Up to this point in time, most theorists did not take into account the social aspect of an organization. A second important takeaway from the Hawthorne experiment was the importance of group interaction. Another thing that Mayo and his colleagues recognized is that they put people into groups. And if there was a member of a group that was not pulling their weight, was not working hard enough and being productive enough, other members of the group would then put pressure on that person to work harder and be more productive because the other members of the group didn't want this person to make everyone else in the group look bad. So it really led Mayo to recognize that you have all these groups within organizations. And it's important how people interact, not just on a one-to-one basis with each other, but how they interact in groups. And that we have to have a system in our organizations where we recognize and respect the need of people to work in groups with each other. And group dynamics had a big impact then on the productivity level of people working in the Hawthorne plant. Now, when you get to 696 research methods, you'll return to the Hawthorne experiments. You return to them to talk about the idea of what's called the Hawthorne effect. And the Hawthorne effect says that when you watch someone, when you pay attention to someone, they're going to act differently than when they are not being watched. And from a research perspective, it means that if you are observing someone's behavior and they know they're being observed, they're going to behave differently than if they were not being observed. So that's just another part of Elton Mayo that contributes to how we study public administration and public organizations. But again, with Mayo, he's contributing this social aspect to our understanding of organizations. So Follett, Barnard, and Mayo all really start placing more of a value on individual employees, much more so than what we saw in the classical school. However, there was an issue. And the issue with the human relations school is that, yes, the human relations school started paying more attention to the wants, needs, and desires of individual employees. However, the reason why they were doing that was not for the benefit necessarily of individual employees. The reason was for the benefit of the organization. They were paying attention to individual employees because of what they could then get out of those employees in terms of contributions and productivity that would then make the organization more effective, more to achieve its macro level goals. So the focus was still on the macro level, the organizational goals, rather than individual goals. Helping people at an individual level was all just a step toward making the organization more effective and more efficient. Because of that, we saw a new school of thought grow up known as the Human Resource Management School. And the Human Resource Management School, the primary reason why they organized was because of this problem with the Human Relations School. The Human Relations School still was looking at organizational goals without really valuing individual development. You will notice through this, and again, this thing gets us into the 1950s and into the 1960s, but you'll notice throughout this evolution of the approach to studying organizations that each new school of thought emerges as what we call a rejoinder to the previous school. They emerge as a response or a criticism of some perceived flaw in the previous school. Human relations develop because of the dehumanizing approach to individual employees taken by the classical school. The Human Resource Management School develops because of the criticism that the Human Relations School was exploiting individual employees to just get contributions from them to achieve organizational goals. The difference here with the Human Resource Management School, the Human Resource Management School, for the first time, really starts looking at developing employees as human resources, that it's important to develop the resources and the skills of individual employees, not just for what they can give to the organization, but how that will benefit individual employees themselves. For a true human resource management theorist, if you develop the skills and build the resources of individual employees, and those employees then take those skills and leave the organization and go to a different organization, that's okay, because you have achieved the goal of helping those individual employees develop. It's not all about the macro organizational goal. Now it becomes about the micro focus of the goals of individual employees. And that's the big difference between Human Resource Management School and Human Relations School. Now, again, there are a lot of human resource management theorists that you'll talk about when you get to organization theory. But for our limited purposes here in this class, the big three that we talked about are Abraham Maslow, Douglas McGregor, and Chris Argyris. Abraham Maslow, his contribution to human resource management theory is a psychological one. So his approach comes from the field of psychology. And for Maslow, he believed that every individual employee had what he called a hierarchy of needs. The hierarchy of needs you can see there on the screen in that pyramidal shape. The bottom, you have physiological needs. So there are physiological needs such as food, such as water, such as shelter. Those are your physiological needs. The next level up is you have safety needs. Everyone has the need to feel safe from harm. Next level up, you have your belonging needs. Everyone wants to feel that they belong to something, that they are part of something bigger. Next level up, your esteem needs. Everyone needs to feel that they're held in high esteem by those around them, by their coworkers and their friends and their family members. And then at the apex of this pyramid of the hierarchy of needs, you have what he called self-actualization. Self-actualization is essentially being all that you can be. It's essentially developing to your utmost potential. The importance here, there are a couple of areas of importance. One area of importance here is that, as you can see, self-actualization is separate from the other four levels of needs. The bottom four levels of needs, physiological, safety, belonging, and esteem, those needs are considered to be deficiency needs, meaning that, according to Maslow, people are motivated by deficiencies in those needs. So if you don't have enough food, you're going to be motivated to try and go out there and get adequate food so you're not hungry anymore, or get adequate sources of water. That's the motivation, is the deficiency that you are feeling. If you don't feel safe, you're going to try and pursue activities that will make you feel safer. So you're motivated by deficiencies. Once those deficiencies have been rectified, once you have filled those deficiencies, then that no longer serves as a motivator. So once you have enough food, then you're not motivated by food right then. If you have enough water, then you're no longer being motivated at that moment by water. When deficiencies are met, it ceases to be a motivator. That's different than self-actualization. Self-actualization is considered to be, I usually like to call it a growth need. It's a being or a growth need, which means that self-actualization never ends. You're always motivated by your need to grow as a human being. And we're never completely satisfied. We're never completely self-actualized. So you motivate people who are at the self-actualization level by providing them opportunities to develop and opportunities to grow as a person to become all that they can be. Second important implication of Maslow's hierarchy of needs is that everyone has a different hierarchy. Not everyone's hierarchy is the same. For some people, safety needs are more important than physiological needs. For some people, esteem needs are more important than belonging needs. So different employees may have a different ordering to their hierarchy of needs. Well, so what? Why do we include Maslow and his hierarchy of needs in this discussion of human resource management theory? Because it shows us we need to understand our individual employees and we need to help them fulfill these deficiencies and then help them grow in terms of becoming all that they can be through professional development and training types of opportunities. And again, we're doing it not just for the benefit of the organization, but we're also doing it for the benefit of the individual employee. To borrow a phrase from President Kennedy, when he said, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Here we're talking about ask not just what employees can do for the organization, but also what can the organization do for employees. And that's really the big approach in the human resource management school of thought. But before we leave Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that as Maslow got older and as Maslow got to the end of his career, he actually made some changes to his hierarchy of needs. And that self-actualization, that growth need, he changed that up a little bit. So it wasn't just about becoming all that you could be, but it was about what you gave back to your community and what you gave back to others around you, and kind of the legacy that you are leaving to society, to your family, your friends, your organizations, but kind of what you have given back through the course of your life. So it kind of went beyond just the individual person and more to what the individual person did for others. Our next human resource management theorist is Douglas McGregor. Douglas McGregor was a big fan of Abraham Maslow, based a lot of his theories on Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And McGregor developed for us what he called theory X versus theory Y. That's what he's best known for, theory X versus theory Y. And I know they don't sound like they're very catchy titles for theories, but in theory X, McGregor argued that theory X views individual employees as being lazy, as being not very creative, not wanting to work, not being very intelligent. It was basically very much a classical view of individual employees, much like how Weber and how Taylor would have viewed an individual. That's what he referred to as theory X. He then contrasts that with theory Y. And theory Y was just the complete opposite of theory X. Theory Y said that people are not lazy, that work is as natural as recreation, that people are intelligent, that people are creative and innovative, that people seek out authority and seek out responsibility. They're motivated to acquire more responsibility and authority. It's a complete opposite of theory X. McGregor says the importance of theory X and theory Y is that we need to recognize that the majority of our employees are theory Y employees. Now, not everyone. Every organization has some clunkers, I guess, but most people are like theory Y in that they are smart, they are creative, they work, they're motivated. Most employees are theory Y. That's a good thing. The problem, though, is that most of our organizations are theory X organizations. So McGregor said what we are basically doing is we are taking theory Y employees and we are shoehorning them into Theory X organizations. So he says that it becomes very important for us to reorient our organizations so that they can work toward helping people develop and helping people acquire those additional areas of responsibilities and those additional skill sets. We need to essentially transform our Theory X organizations into Theory Y organizations. Well, that's all well and good, but on a practical level, how do we do it? How do we take a classical Theory X organization and transform it into a Theory Y organization? One approach that McGregor and then Chris Argyris later on would talk about is this approach known as job enrichment. Job enrichment is different than job enlargement. And some of you may have lived through a job enlargement whereby your employer has come and said, we need you to do extra things. We need you to do extra functions. And they've changed your job description to incorporate more types of things that you need to do, more responsibilities, and more functions into your job. That's enlarging your position. That's enlarging your job. If that's something that you did not look for, and that's something you did not entertain, that actually can lead to a lack of motivation. Instead of job enlargement, McGregor and Argyris talked about job enrichment, whereby you work with the employee to change their job description so that they can have the opportunity to do different types of things, that they can have the opportunity to develop the types of skills that they want to develop. So for instance, you sit down with an employee and you say, where do you see yourself in 10 years? What's the trajectory of your career? And they might say, well, I would like to be a manager someday. Okay, you want to be a manager or leader in the organization, we can help you get there. And we can help you get there maybe through some management training programs. Maybe we can help you get there through some leadership training. Maybe there's some tuition reimbursement we can do for you to go back and get your MPA degree or to get a certificate in leadership. What types of things can we provide to you in your job that will then allow you to get to that level? Are there management opportunities whereby we can allow you to manage certain types of new upcoming projects so you can get some experience managing individuals? That's job enrichment. Yes, it's enlarging the job, but it's enlarging the job in consultation with the employee to enlarge it to help the employee enrich themselves as human resources and to expand their skill base. So job enrichment is one major strategy that McGregor says we can use in order to try and transform our Theory X organizations into Theory Y organizations. Then the next author you see down there is Chris Argyris. Chris Argyris is not nearly as well known as Douglas McGregor. He was a student of Douglas McGregor's, and he essentially took McGregor's Theory Y and Theory X argument and built upon it. Argyris used Theory X and Theory Y to create what he called his personal growth needs theory. And personal growth need theory says that individual employees go through a maturation process. And as they age and as they spend time in the organization, they will naturally go through this arc of personal growth. The arc of personal growth, the maturation process, means that as people age, as people mature, they become more interested in long-term goals as opposed to short-term goals. They start looking in the future, 15, 20, 25 years in the future, rather than looking just at tomorrow. They start being concerned about their community and how they interact with the community, how they can give back to their community. They aspire to what we call superordinate positions. So rather than just being happy staying in a subordinate position, they aspire to superordinate positions. They aspire to supervisory positions. And the job of the organization, according to Argyris, is to help people through this personal growth process. So a goal of the organization is no longer just effectiveness and efficiency. A goal of the organization is now helping people on their journey to personal growth. And so again, it really becomes what the organization can then do for the individual employee. With McGregor and Ardress, we're talking about 50s, 60s, 1970s, and so we're getting a little bit more modern in terms of a chronological progression. But what's more important is really the progression away from the classical school. Now we are saying every individual employee is different, so there's no one size fits all approach to matching all employees. And we're also saying that there is a job of the organization. There is a moral imperative of the organization to not just try and accomplish its goals, but then to also help develop employees, to help employees better meet and achieve their goals as well. However, I always say however as we move from one school of thought to another. However, there is still something missing here in the way in which we are looking at our organizations. Classical theorists looked at internal to the organization in terms of structure or work process or management functions. Human relations theorists looked internal to the organization in terms of how you could get more contributions from your employees by actually paying attention to those employees. And I recognize in the social aspect inside of organizations. Even human resource management theorists still looked inside the organization. They were still having this very internal focus. What was missing was the relationship between the organization and its external environment. Shouldn't we, in studying our organization, start to look beyond the walls of the organization itself and start looking at the environment that it interacts with? That's what then leads us to systems theory and the system school of thought. So the system school of thought grows up, if you will, as a response to the internal focus of the previous schools, recognizing that we really need to look at the organization as part of a system. And it's in this ecology of an environment and it operates within a system. There are two basic approaches to the systems approach to studying organizations. The first approach is what's known as the closed or natural approach. And the second approach is known as the open systems approach. In the closed or natural approach to studying systems theory, we are again kind of looking inside the organization, but we're looking at how the external environment is going to impact what's going on within the organization. So a lot of closed systems theorists look at it from kind of a natural perspective, whereby they will liken an organization to a living organism. And earlier on in this class, we mentioned this author known as John Gauss, and we said the ecology of public administration, that much like you want to understand why a plant develops the way in which it develops, you look at the amount of water and the amount of sunlight it gets. Well, it's kind of similar here. You want to look at how an organization behaves and how an organization matures and develops. You have to understand the system in which it is located. What the natural systems theorists would say is we view an organization as a living organism. All living organisms go through what's referred to as an entropy process. The entropy process is a process through which living organisms dissipate energy into their environment until one point in time they get to the point where there's not enough energy in that organism to sustain it, and that organism will then die. It will then go out of existence. Organizations are similar to that, in that organizations also go through an entropy process whereby they dissipate energy out into resources, energy out into the environment until they no longer have the energy and resources necessary in order to survive. That's kind of a negative view of people and organisms and organizations. But fear not, because the open systems theorists disagree with that. And open systems theorists say that, yes, organizations operate within a system. They're part of a system. However, this entropy process is not necessarily just a one-way street. Yes, as organisms age, they lose energy and dissipate energy. As organizations age, they dissipate energy into the environment as well. However, it is possible for those organizations to import new energies in from their surrounding environment. That's what open systems theorists refer to as negative entropy. Yes, you lose energy into your environment, but you can replace that by bringing new energies in from the environment. So we're talking about energies and resources that an organization can bring in from its environment. We're talking about things such as money, so appropriations. So an organization can do a lot of things in order to enhance the amount of appropriations it's getting from a legislative body. That's importing energy and resources into the organization. Another example of resources could be a stable, well-trained workforce. And so if your environment has a stable, well-trained labor force, you can bring new people into your organization. They'll bring new thoughts and ideas and skills and energies into the organization to help revitalize the organization. Another resource you can get from your external environment is political support. Maybe you can get more support from elected officials, and you can get more support from other organizations, and that will then be more energy you can bring into the organization. So it's not just a situation where organizations wither and die. Organizations can stave off extermination by bringing in these new resources from their external environment. So open systems theory is really more about the relationships, two-way street relationship between the organization and its environment. What does the organization give to the environment? What does the environment give to the organization? Some very healthy organizations have gone out of existence because their surrounding environment is incapable of supporting them. So if the surrounding environment doesn't have enough money to support the agency, it goes out of existence. If the surrounding environment doesn't agree with what the agency is doing, it can go out of existence. If the surrounding environment doesn't have an adequate labor pool to supply to the organization, it can go out of existence. One example of this in open systems theory is an organization that I used to like a lot. It was the United States Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. That is a mouthful, but it's usually referred to as the ACIR, or was referred to as ACIR, the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations. The Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations was essentially a research-based organization that would contract with federalism scholars around the country to do work on the relationship between national, state, and local governments, and produce a great bit of research and some very useful research on how the different levels of government interact with each other, and did so for about 40 some years. In 1995, the ACIR put together a draft report that recommended taking some existing programs and shifting them from national control, congressional control, to state control. It was a draft report that Congress got wind of. It had never actually been approved by the commission, but Congress was very unhappy with that draft report. They didn't want to give up control over these programs and policies, so they took the funding away from the ACIR. They did that in fiscal year 1996, and the ACIR had to shutter its windows, close its doors, and go out of business after 40 years. That's an example of the environment no longer willing to provide the resources that that organization needed to survive. As members of public organizations and even members of nonprofit organizations, the vast majority of us work within an open system. We are influenced by a lot of the elements of our external environment. So I think one of the primary contributions of systems theory to how we study public organizations is that contribution of understanding how the organization interacts with its external environment. And most organizational studies today will take into account the external environment as well. And I think the systems theory, even though it would kind of started to develop in the 1960s and into the 1970s, is still a very appropriate way of studying public organizations. So that's what we call the system school of thought. As we fast forward more into modern approaches, there are a lot of different modern approaches that you will cover in your organization theory class, but we just kind of pull out one here to focus on for our limited scope. And the one I like to focus on as a modern approach is what's called organization culture, the school of organization culture. Organization culture argues that every organization has its own unique culture. So my question to you is, what is a culture? When we say culture, what do we mean? What do you mean by culture? We oftentimes say political culture, and we say, every country has its own political culture. What do we mean by culture? Any ideas of culture? Here we go. Miriam says organizational environment. Yeah, the environment will certainly have an impact upon the organization, environment of the workforce. Yeah, how you deal with people in the organization, expectations in terms of behavior in the organization, as well as expectations for behavior between the organization and the environment. Culture is essentially a set of shared norms and values and expectations. So their expectations for how we will behave, that's a culture. And so, every country has its own political culture. Some political cultures are very open in that they have a lot of methods for direct political participation. You think about the political culture here in California, like we talked about in our first class together. Here in California, we have a lot of measures of direct democracy. We have initiatives, we have referenda that allow people to directly make decisions and participate in their own governance. A lot of other states in the country don't have an initiative system. And so the voters don't have the ability to put issues on the ballot. So our political culture is more open in that regard than you would have in a political culture that doesn't allow for those mechanisms of direct democracy. So cultures are expectation for behaviors, norms, and accepted values. So organization culture says that every organization has its own set of expectations that may be different from other organizations. So when we study organizations in public administration, we need to understand the unique culture of that organization. So the question then becomes, how can we study culture? So culture, norms, and values and expectations seems kind of esoteric. It seems something that's not that difficult, not that easy to try and measure. So how do we go about measuring organization culture? Well, we borrow from the worlds of anthropology and archaeology. We borrow some of the approaches that they use in trying to study culture. So if you're trying to study an ancient society, you're an archaeologist and you're in Egypt or someplace trying to study an ancient society, you're going to go on an archaeological dig. And in that archaeological dig, you are going to dig up artifacts. So an archaeologist might dig up a eating utensil, or might dig up a bowl, or may dig up some type of artwork. And those are all artifacts. And artifacts are physical manifestations that will help us understand what that society valued and how that society behaved. So artifacts are those tangible, physical types of manifestations of culture. As students of public organizations, we can also dig up artifacts from organizations as well. For our organizations, artifacts can be tangible things such as agendas for meetings, minutes from meetings, policy and procedure handbooks. Those are all tangible artifacts that will give us insight into how that organization operates and what that organization believes in and the expectations for behavior within that organization. Artifacts are very easy to see. So that's a very simple way of studying culture, but it's also a very shallow way of studying organization culture as well. There are deeper indications of culture beyond just artifacts. Another expression of culture is what we refer to as the espoused values of that organization. So the espoused values of that organization will be things such as the organization's vision, perhaps the mission statement of the organization. This is what the organization is telling you. This is who we are. This is who we want to be. This is what we believe in as an organization. They are espoused values in that the organization's telling you about them. They're saying, this is what we value. This is who we are. This is who we would like to be. Again, They may be a little bit more difficult to get than a tangible artifact, but they're still kind of tangible. There's still something that we can readily examine to understand the unique culture of that organization. Where studying organization culture becomes much more difficult is studying what are called basic assumptions. Every organization culture will have its own set of basic assumptions. Basic assumptions are basically things that people believe in, the beliefs that we all share, but we don't talk about a lot. So we may all share the belief that we value each other and we're going to treat each other in a collegial, professional manner. That's kind of an expectation for behavior. We don't talk about it a lot, but it's an expectation that everyone shares. It's an assumption we all share. And it's an assumption that will then guide the behavior of everyone within that organization. Basic assumptions are much deeper and they're much more difficult for us to get at as students of public organizations. Cultures differ between organizations, and leaders have the ability to embed cultures into their organizations. If you've had a new leader come into your organization in recent years, you may have seen that leader bring a culture with them and try and embed that culture into the organization. There are primary embedding mechanisms and secondary and tertiary embedding mechanisms you'll learn about in your 660 course. But for our purposes, essentially, things such as slogans. So a new leader comes in the organization, they want to embed a new culture, and they'll do it partly through the use of a slogan. When I was on the school board, we hired a new superintendent. The superintendent came in with a culture, with wanting to embed more of a culture of teamwork. And so she brought with her, I think it was Together We Achieve More. And that was the slogan. And that then went on all of the district stationery. It went on all the signatures on all emails. It went up on the wall in the boardroom. It was something that was pervasive throughout the entire organization to help communicate and embed that culture of teamwork into the organization. The important thing for organization culture, though, is that we have come a long way in our development of how we study our organizations. And if you're looking for that one big thread that runs through the entire chronological development of organization theory and theoretical approaches, that one big thread is a movement away from the one size fits all approach and a movement toward a more nuanced contextual approach. Organization culture tells us every organization is different and every organization needs to be studied differently depending upon the context of that situation. The classical theorists were all searching in vain for the one size fits all approach, the one magic bullet that will make our organizations effective and efficient. But we have learned over time that there is no one magic bullet. We have to take a much more contextual, nuanced approach to studying our public organizations. That means that studying public organizations is more difficult today than it was if you were a student of public administration in the early 1900s. It's much more accurate, but it's also much more complex and much more difficult. So when you're thinking about the whole idea of public administration as an academic discipline and whether or not it represents an academic discipline, think about some of these theories that we have talked about, some of these schools of thought, and how unique some of these theories and schools of thought are. Organization culture is not necessarily unique to public administration. It's something that, again, grows out of archaeology, anthropology type of an approach. Elton Mayo grew out of a psychology approach. Abraham Maslow grew out of a psychology approach. Frederick Taylor grew out of much more of a private sector type of an approach. But then we have people like Douglas McGregor and Chris Argyris, who did focus primarily on public sector organizations. We have people like Luther Gulling, who also very much developed theories for public organizations. And so it's kind of a mixture in public administration. Most of our theories are not original. Most of our theories came from other disciplines, but we have developed some of our own theories that are unique to what we study in the field of public administration. Again, I'm going to leave it up to you to determine whether or not you think public administration is a standalone academic discipline or merely a field of study, a subfield within another academic discipline. That's something you're going to tell me about in Canvas essay number 4, as well as on scenario number 4 for your midterm assessment. So at this point in time, are there any questions about any of this information that we have covered in terms of the theoretical approaches? Again, this was a very quick overview of about 150 years or so of the development of how we study public administration. You'll get into a much more detailed discussion of it once you get into your 660 organization theory course. But I think it just really fits in very nicely here with our discussion of what public administration is and what we study and how we study public organizations. So any questions or clarifications on any of this information? Okay. If not, then I am kind of inclined to, this wraps up all the information that's covered on the midterm assessment that is due on Sunday. So rather than going into new information, I'm kind of inclined at this point to kind of stop, give you the remainder of the time tonight to kind of digest this and continue working on the midterm assessment that is due on Monday. I'm sorry, on Sunday. And then when we get back together next Tuesday, we're going to turn our attention more toward the functions of public administration. We'll start looking at what we do as public administrators. We'll talk about things such as how we make decisions in the public sector as leaders and managers. We'll talk about how we formulate, implement, and evaluate public policies. We'll talk about how we evaluate the effectiveness of public programs. We will talk about how we manage human resources, and we'll talk about how we manage fiscal resources. And so the functional approach to what we do as public administrators will begin next week, and then we'll take us through the end of our course together. Okay. Again, any questions on the midterm assessment, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, I hope you have a great week. I'll have this recording up and available on our Canvas site no later than tomorrow morning. And then we'll be back at it again for week number 6 next Tuesday. All right. All right. Thanks, everyone. Have a great week. Take care.